All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. It is 11 o'clock Central. And so, out of respect for your time, we're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to start with a couple of housekeeping items. If you have any questions, and I'm sure you will during this presentation, please use the chat function and send those to host and panelists. And we're going to have Brian Mills, our general counsel at GCFA, answering those questions. We're probably going to go break it up and answer them as we go along here a little bit. And then anything we don't get to, we'll try and catch at the end. Also, today's presentation and the recording of today's presentation and the slides will be sent to everyone who registered for this webinar. So you can expect to receive those. And as always, if you have any ideas for topics that would help you in your ministry, please feel free to lift those up to us, put them in the chat, or you can respond to the email you get. And we would love to know those ideas because at GCFA, it's our ministry to support your ministry. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started with the Accountable Reimbursement webinar. And I'm going to turn it over to Brian Mills, General Counsel.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Jensen. So I think this will be most effective for all of you if we can make it as interactive as possible. We've got 54 folks right now in the room. So as Jensen said, we'll have to do questions via chat so it doesn't get too crazy. But as we go through, put your questions in. I'll try and answer them in the moment. If we miss any, we'll come back to them because there's really not very many slides to go through. This is a topic where the kind of the devil's in the details, as it were, with specific situations and things. When I do this as part of a larger presentation covering other things, this is one that tends to get some of the most questions because it comes up pretty much for everybody at some point. Everybody's got a story or a situation that they've dealt with in this area. So with all of that out of the way, we'll get right to it. So this is just kind of what we're going to go through. And again, this is pretty much the number of slides that we have. So please ask your questions as they come up. So we'll start from the beginning and talk about what an accountable reimbursement plan is. At a very high level, the concept here is this is a way for an employer to reimburse employees for business-related expenses. It's important to understand that or important to realize that it is not just for clergy employees. Companies like GE have accountable reimbursement plans if they want to reimburse their employees. So it's lay employees, it's clergy employees. It's not limited to one or the other. Church can have, and probably should, if it has this type of plan or policy, have it be applicable to all of its employees. So of course, in the day-to-day operations of a church or in any other kind of organization, somebody might need to go to the store and buy paper clips or paper or ink for the printer. And maybe they don't have a credit card for the church, so they have to use their own money, maybe initially, to go make the purchase. Or somebody goes on a trip or needs to drive somewhere and they have to fill the car with gas because of the driving that they've been doing, or they had to buy a plane ticket. And again, maybe they don't have the benefit of a church or a company provided credit card where that is ultimately paid directly by the organization. They have to pay it out of their own pocket initially. For situations like that, you have an accountable reimbursement plan in place, so you can reimburse the employee for that business-related expense. And the big benefit of the plan being accountable is that you can then, those reimbursements are on a non-taxable basis, which is really important for the employee, from the employee perspective, obviously. And again, this is just employees in general. We're not talking about just clergy or lay here. Why is it so important? Well, typically it's important under normal circumstances prior to 2018, because an employee that has business-related expenses that are not reimbursed by an employer, if that employee is able to do Schedule A and itemize deductions, which a lot of individuals may not be able to, maybe because they don't have a mortgage, they don't have other types of things that would justify doing the itemization rather than taking a standard deduction. But even employees who can do the itemization, there's a 2% floor for unreimbursed business expenses. What that means is, and it's a 2% floor of adjusted gross income, or AGI. So if somebody has an adjusted gross income of $100,000 and they have $1,500 in unreimbursed business expenses, well, their 2% floor is $2,000, so they cannot deduct anything. That same individual had $2,500 in unreimbursed business-related expenses. The 2% floor would take off the first $2,000 of that, and they would only be able to deduct $500. So having these expenses reimbursed by an employer on a non-taxable basis saves the employee money in this important way. Unfortunately, the big caveat right now is that it's not so much a caveat, but it's even worse for employers right now, because the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act eliminated the deduction completely for 2018 to 2025. So there is no floor, there is no ability to deduct these unreimbursed expenses at all for that time period. Now, these are set to, a lot of the provisions of that act are set to sunset. So unless Congress does something else between now and then, the 2% floor should come back starting in 2026, but then it just reverts to the way it has been historically, which is you've got to hit that 2% floor, and then you can only exclude or deduct what is above that 2%. And that makes that group of people that have the ability to do that even smaller. And then they still have to pay essentially taxes on that first $2,000. So of course, all of that is to say, what the last point on this slide is that ultimately employers are worse off from an income tax standpoint if their employer doesn't use an accountable plan. The requirements are actually pretty straightforward. They have to be reimbursed expenses, must have a business connection. That should be obvious, but unfortunately, maybe not always. So these are not for personal expenses. These are for business-related expenses. There has to be an adequate accounting within a quote-unquote reasonable period. 60 days is essentially a safe harbor there, which is to say, if your employee submits the accounting information, the substantiation information for the expenses within 60 days of the expenses happening, that's going to be considered sufficient. That'll be deemed reasonable. You take a risk if it takes longer than that, if it ended up being determined later to not be a reasonable period. So make sure your requirement is within 60 days. And then if there's any excess reimbursements or advances, those have to be returned again within a reasonable period. There, the reasonable period kind of safe harbor is 120 days. So if you're sending somebody on a work trip and they don't have a business credit card, and you give them $2,000 in cash in advance to cover expenses over the course of the trip, and they come back and they provide you with receipts that show they spent $1,500, that means they have $500 in cash left over that you gave them. That $500 needs to be returned within 120 days. And if it's not, it's likely going to be considered taxable income to the employee. It would definitely be considered taxable income if they never return the $500 and they just keep it. But there is a point at which even if they do return it, it might still be treated as taxable income, or at least it's not going to be considered covered by the accountable plan and then be non-taxable on this basis. So if you have policies about this, you know, and you're setting requirements for employees on when they have to do certain things, make sure you're setting them at least at 60 days and 120 days. You can, of course, have shorter time frames, but stay away from going longer than that.
Brian, we got our first question. If your employer is okay with you turning in receipts on a quarterly basis, is it okay then to exceed that, quote, reasonable period of 60 days?
I see. Yes, it just answered it. Yeah, you're taking your employer and you. I mean, really, this is who this ultimately hurts is you as the employee, because it doesn't change for the employer. If you reimburse $500 in expenses, it's $500 regardless. Well, no, I guess I shouldn't say that, because if this is a layperson, it ends up being $500 in taxable income. That means the employer is paying the employer's share of FICA on that. So there's could be a financial difference for both the employee and the employer. But so that would be, you know, quarterly basis would basically be 90 days, which is more than 60 days. That's outside of the safe harbor, so that's a gamble. Whether the IRS, if it ever came in and looked at something, would determine that was a reasonable period. I would highly recommend sticking within what the IRS has said it deems to definitely be a reasonable period of 60 days or less, and just be safe on that. But you know, it's ultimately it's not a hard and fast standard, but safe harbors, when somebody says we're going to deem this to be reasonable, that's really the best thing to stay within, so you don't run the risk. You know, it's just an unnecessary risk to not be within that safe harbor. So this is where the rubber really meets the road, in my opinion, for accountable reimbursement plans. It's what is actually being reimbursed. And I've got a slide here from what's appropriate, and the next slide, as you might guess, is what's not appropriate. This is typically where a lot of questions come up. A lot of disagreements can happen at the church. You can get a lot of people, you know, it's possible for somebody to get very unhappy. They thought something was going to be reimbursed through the plan, and the church says, no, that's not appropriate. And we'll get to some of that here in a second, and maybe some ways to head some of that off at the pass. But by and large, these are what you would probably expect. So again, and we're talking ultimately about business related expenses. One way to think about this is what your employer can reimburse to you on a non-taxable basis would be an expense that you could deduct as a business expense on your personal tax return. Now, you know, again, with the 2% floor in the recent Tax Reform Act, there would be limitations on whether you actually could meet. Right now, you can't do it at all, and then you've got the 2% floor. But that it would be, if those hurdles were not there, is it an actual legitimate business related expense that you could deduct, something that you could count towards that. That's kind of the standard here. So there's some obvious things that would apply. Yeah, I already used church office supplies as an example. If you need to go to Office Max and buy more printer paper, continuing education if it's related to your job, a computer for doing work for the church, church related books and periodicals, magazine subscriptions, something like that that is related to work. So not Field and Stream, probably subscription, or Sports Illustrated, to the extent magazines are still even a thing that people subscribe to. You know, probably not. Travel related expenses are obvious, you know, from a clergy standpoint, visits to hospitals and homes, or other people within the congregation that maybe are not able to get to the church. I see the question about vestments. That is specific clergy attire. And you'll see the counterpart to that here in a second on the next slide. So think like the robes and those types of things that are very clearly for work purposes, kind of the equivalent of a uniform. And then if we shift to the flip side of the point, things that do not work. You see the opposite of vestments there, everyday clothing, including suits. And the idea being those can easily be used for non-business related things. Mileage between church and home for daily work, that's a personal commuting expense. Unfortunate for many of us, at least pre-pandemic, that drove significant miles every day to and from work. Those are commuting expenses that we do not get to deduct. Meals with friends. So the pastor is going out with a buddy for lunch, even if they kind of talk about church topics at some point or another, that's not a business lunch. Business lunches are things that I think are commonly get stretched well beyond what they are intended to be from an IRS standpoint. Just because there's 5 of you at the office that day and you all go, hey, let's go to lunch, that doesn't make it a business lunch. A business lunch is you're conducting work during the time that you're eating. And kind of think of it, is it really necessary that we're working on this big project and we don't have time to stop for lunch? We've ordered some food to be delivered and we're going to eat it as we go while we're working. That kind of thing is very obviously what was intended. The further you get removed from that, the less likely that it fits within what was intended. The next two, spouses, travel, and vacations, also are things that come up fairly regularly and can be topics of disagreement between pastor and church, especially a spouse traveling with the pastor, or if you've got we've got annual conference folks in here today, the bishop traveling, and the bishop's spouse is traveling along. Unless that spouse is also an employee or something similar and is also on the trip for business reasons, so is doing business related stuff and is not just along for the ride, as it were, that is not a business related expense for the bishop or the pastor, and thus that is not something that would be appropriate for reimbursement out of accountable reimbursement fund. Or through an accountable plan. I see the comment there about Holy Land for educational purposes. That's tell me what education aspect is, and it might work. Is it just we just took a trip to the Holy Land and we looked around and saw some of the historic monuments and things, or was it an actual tour? I think a lot of bishops will take groups, and there will be sermons and there will be learning, and it'll be structured, and it'll be going to specific places. They may even be going through a tour company where that is the intent. That is likely sufficient. If it's just we're going to the Holy Land and we're going to see some stuff, and that's important in the history of Christianity and religion, that's probably not going to be sufficient. That looks more like a vacation where you're doing sightseeing. And then travel to funeral, whether the minister is personally paid an honorarium for his or her service. The distinction here is that is a business matter for the pastor, but for him or her as an individual, not as a representative of the church. And why? Because the family is paying that in the pastor an honorarium, so that's independent. It's self-employment income at that point, and something the church should not be really dealing with. Now, if it's a member of the church who has died, and part of the pastor's responsibility as being the pastor of that church is if the family requests to do the funeral service for that individual, and it doesn't amount to additional income to the pastor, it's just part of the pastor's normal church responsibilities, then that would be properly reimbursable under an accountable plan. And I'm going to stop and scroll up.
Yeah,
Jensen, 'cause
we have
I know we
some.
got some questions.
We're gonna kind of. I think it's best to work from the bottom to the top. As I'm reading these. So first, I'll read them off to you. So first question is, what if the pastor donates the honorarium to the church? So let's say they get an honorarium for a funeral service, I'm assuming.
Yeah, that doesn't make it a business expense, because it was received in a self-employment capacity by the pastor. So it's not really addressed by an accountable plan at all. It could, if it is truly, in fact, a donation or a gift. So if it's just basically the pastor's giving $500 to the church as a donation, or wherever that $500 came from originally, doesn't really matter at that point. And then, it could be deductible by the pastor as a charitable donation.
What about books and tuition for course of study?
That is probably fine. That's similar to some type of continuing legal education, or some type that I have to do as a lawyer, and in order to keep my license. And if I don't have my license, I can't do my job. So it's very clearly for me a business expense. I would get disbarred if I didn't do it ultimately. So that's a business expense for me. So if GCFA wants to reimburse me for that, then all of that checks out. So that's really the standard. So to the extent it is tied to the job, and it is related to being able to continue to do the job, or to improve doing the job, or to advance into other positions, then it probably works out and probably meets the standard. If a pastor of a church is also is in the midst of dental school, and the church reimburses tuition for the dental school, unless that's a dentistry ministry that the church is looking to create, that probably is not going to work. So just make sure it's related to the job the individual is doing, or maybe the next job that the employer wants the individual to do.
This next one's a fun one. 2-point charge. The first service or first church that they serve is near their home. Are the miles between the first and second service reimbursed?
So I agree with always confusing with the IRS info we have looked at. I agree 100%. When mileage or miles traveled is considered a business expense, and thus deductible by the individual or reimbursable on a non-taxable basis by an employer, is one of the most confounding topics, I think. I have seen charts that and pictures and visual representations, I think, are the best things that I've seen, as far as being able to do the job as clearly as possible. You get into multiple work locations, and what's the main work site. So generally, if you have a primary work location that you drive to in the morning, that trip is commuting. That's not a business expense. And then go to other places, and then come home later. That last trip is commuting. So this is a situation where there's trips in between. Those probably, there's a good chance that they would be those trips in between. You still have the first trip and the last trip that would not be. especially if you've got multiple site locations. So you drive to your first or your primary work site, and then you need to travel to other work locations along and during the day. Those probably can be considered business expenses and thus would be reimbursable, the mileage or the actual expenses incurred. But I agree, it's very, very tricky. There's a publication about business expenses that I would commend to you. I don't have it off the top of my head. If I can't find it while we're doing this, I'll make sure I get it to Jensen afterwards so he can circulate it to everyone. I believe that is where it has the visual representation that I have pictured in my brain that is the best thing I've seen to try and help work through those.
This next question is another interesting one. Church had hardwired security cameras in place. The pastor had the company come in and move one of the cameras, but without the approval of the trustees. So, of course, there are fees involved in moving that camera. So subsequently, the fees for this work were charged against the pastor's reimbursement account or reimbursable account. Is this allowable?
There's a lot going on here.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, a first level issue is authority to make certain types of decisions and to incur expenses. And that in and of itself is irrelevant for an accountable plan. We went through the requirements for an accountable plan. It has to be reimbursing legitimate business expenses. It has to be done within the documentation needs to be provided within a certain amount of time. And if there's excess advances or reimbursements made, those need to be given back within a certain amount of time. None of that speaks to who has the authority to decide to incur the expense. Does the pastor have the autonomy to decide on a daily basis, I need to go visit this person and this person, that person, and then seek reimbursement for those expenses? Does the pastor have the authority to decide, I need a new laptop for church, and so I'm going to go buy one and then have the church reimburse it? So those are, like, you can consider them purchasing policies or rules or limitations. Those are important to have as part of this whole process of determining when and what the church spends money on from an expenses standpoint. So this kind of speaks to that issue that maybe there are policies maybe that weren't followed, I don't know, or there aren't policies when there need to be. The question I would have at the end about it being taken out of the reimbursable account, that's a little confusing to me, in that I don't really see this as a business expense of the pastor. So in other words, the cost of relocating a security camera at the church, I don't think would be a deductible business expense on the pastor's tax return, if that makes sense. So I don't know. I mean, the church paying it is probably necessary at this point from the security company's standpoint, and then you got to deal with internally, we don't want this to happen again. But I don't know that it makes sense for it to come out of the reimbursable, I guess, by account, like the reimbursable fund. I mean, ultimately, I guess that is the church's money until it's not. So if it decides to move it around, then it can probably do that. But I just would want to make sure that it's not, it's not a business expense of the pastor. So just make sure everything kind of is clean from that standpoint. I see somebody's confused about the 2% floor. Yes, you're right. The first 2% would not be deductible. Not 2% of your expenses, 2% of your AGI. And again, you don't have to worry about this right now because business expenses are not deductible on Schedule A. Again, this is for people who are treated as employees from an income tax standpoint. That's who we're talking about. not independent contractors or self-employed individuals from a income tax standpoint. So this is Schedule A, not Schedule C. Historically, Schedule A has a line for business expenses. That 2% floor again means if my AGI is $100,000, I cannot deduct any business expenses until my total expenses exceed $2,000, which is 2% of my AGI. And only at that, and I can only deduct the excess. So if I had business expenses of $2,001 for the year, I would get to deduct $1. I hope that makes sense now.
This next one, it might be, it's like, I think there might not be enough information to answer, but we're going to give it a go. The pastor travels to preach. So I think the question is about reimbursing mileage, but the pastor receives an honorarium for going and preaching. Would those travel expenses then be reimbursable?
So make sure I understand the situation. Pastor is going somewhere else to preach and is being paid by wherever it is he or she is going for preaching there. If I understand that correctly, that sounds to me, and I'm assuming wherever there is not where the pastor is appointed or typically serves. This is a guest preaching engagement or something. In the other church is paying something to the pastor in exchange for coming. Then to me, I see that as a independent contractor or self-employed income, that then the pastor could potentially deduct the expenses relating to that on Schedule C. But I don't see that as an outgrowth of the relationship between the pastor and the church where he or she serves regularly, thus to make it be covered by an accountable plan by that church. To say it differently, that is a business expense of the pastor, but is not a business expense of the pastor in relation to the pastor's employment with the church that has the accountable plan.
To further clarify, they added that there are several resorts in Colorado that pay pastors to come and preach, which all of a sudden sounds like I need to be going to. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, that sounds pretty good.
But that really reiterates that is freelance work, essentially.
Right.
And so those expenses would need to be deducted by the pastor on their own tax paperwork, not related to the church agreement that they have.
Right. So travel back and forth, having to stay in a hotel room overnight because of how far away it is and that kind of thing. All of that are business expenses of that individual, but in a self-employment capacity, not as the pastor normally of fill in the blank church that typically preaches at on Sundays. And if this is all that person does is move around from place to place, preaching where asked to preach, then that individual basically has all self-employment income at that point, and an accountable plan doesn't even apply, because accountable plans are for employees, for business expenses incurred by employees in the course of their employment. Self-employed individuals, they are the employee and the employer, and what they can deduct as business expenses is kind of a different set of rules.
How about immigration expenses like green card, lawyers' fees, etc.? Are those reimbursable?
I think that's similar. I haven't thought about that specific question before, but my gut reaction is that is similar to the going to school or taking classes type of analysis, where if it's something necessary for being able to work for that church or that employer, or being able to continue to work for that church or that employer, that's probably arguably, let me say that, arguably a business expense of the individual. And that's the standard that we're talking about, is a business expense of the employee. And then typically then it can be reimbursed by the employer on a non-taxable basis. And the other way I think about these things sometimes is it's something that would make sense for the employer to pay for directly. So if the employer directly paid the tuition, would that be considered? Then the question you ask is, that payment of tuition considered taxable income to the employee? And if it's furthering some type of business purpose of the employer, the answer is probably no. I go back to my pastor who's studying to be a dentist example. In that instance, it doesn't really make sense, absent some really unique circumstances, where that is furthering the business interest of the church or of the employer. And so they can pay it, but that's a taxable benefit. Where if it is maybe a licensed local pastor who's going to seminary or something like that and is then that might make sense for the church to be making contributions towards that, or could pay that directly, and it'd be benefit to the church. So it can get squishy. Ultimately, if you get a situation that seems maybe not dictated by anything, that's any guidance that's available, that's when I always lean on, rely on a professional tax advisor of some sort, either a CPA or a tax lawyer to give you some specific advice.
All right, I think we have two more, then we're caught up. Next one is back to the mileage. If the miles are considered commuting and are not reimbursable, can the church still agree to pay for those miles?
100%, but it's taxable.
All right.
Can pay, a church can pay or reimburse employees for whatever it wants to, ultimately. The only question is, that reimbursement taxable or not taxable?
Sorry, I'm about to sneeze. And then we have this newest one, the big one. I'll let you read it when I sneeze.
Well, I see a question about a purchase of a computer is reimbursable. Whose computer is it when the pastor is appointed to another church? We're going to get to that. You're stealing my thunder on a question later, so I'm going to hold off on that, and we'll come back to that exact question in a little bit. Okay, currently separate travel expense and reimbursable expenses in our budget, and to conform with the GCFA pastor compensation form. Maybe the conference pastor compensation form. I don't know that we have one, but if we do, okay, I know the conferences definitely have some. Our pastor has maxed out the travel expense and would like us to pay additional travel expenses out of the remaining reimbursable expense line. Is this okay to do? Okay, let me look at this one more time again. Separate travel expense and reimbursable expenses in our budget. Okay. It is I'll answer from two different aspects. The first aspect is a tax standpoint. The IRS does not require a church or any other type of employer to establish a budget for accountable reimbursement policies or plans. So with the tax treatment, really doesn't matter at all whether the budget at the beginning of the year was $3,500, and only $2,500 was spent, or it was $3,500 and $5,500 was spent. What the IRS cares about was did all of those reimbursements follow the accountable rules? Was it for a legitimate business expense? Was documentation provided within the appropriate time period? And if there were excess reimbursements or advances, were those returned within the appropriate time period? That's all that matters from a taxability versus non-taxability standpoint. So this question is really more about internal church budgeting. And again, going back to something I mentioned, which is the overarching idea of who decides how and when the church's money is spent. So if a church has adopted a budget and its expectation is that the pastor's travel will remain within that budget for the year, and that doesn't happen, then it's not a question of is it taxable or non-taxable to further reimburse. It's just a question of, is the church willing to do that? Or is it going to say, no, you needed to manage this better, or you needed to come to us in advance and tell us that you thought this was going to go over, and we could have a conversation about what would work or not work. So there's nothing from a taxation standpoint or IRS standpoint that prevents the church from saying, well, we had $3,500 budgeted over here, and we had $3,500 budgeted over here for something else. $3,500 has been expended. There's some left in the other bucket, and so we'll pull from that bucket for the excess, and that's fine from a taxation standpoint. The issue is more about internal policies and the functioning of the church and controlling its costs and those types of things. And I just saw the documentation for expenses under $25. I don't remember off the top of my head, but typically employers will say, we require receipts or documentation for expenses above a certain number. 25 is common, 75 is common. It's not so much that the accountable rules necessarily get into that detail. That's more of a internal, making sure money is being spent on what it's supposed to be spent on. So if it's a large purchase, you want some type of proof that what was purchased was actually what was needed, that money was actually spent on what it was supposed to be spent on. Typically employers will cost benefit analysis of keeping track of documentation for minor purchases doesn't really make sense. The one thing I would counsel about is, if your church is not interested in paying for alcohol, you got a $25 less than $25 bill or reimbursement request for lunch or a meal that doesn't have a receipt along with it because it's less than $25. You don't know what you're ultimately paying for. So just something to keep in mind there. Okay. I want to touch on moving expenses really quick, even this is kind of sort of related to accountable plans, but in some ways its own area. And I mention it here because before 2018 and for a long time before 2018, moving expenses could be reimbursed by employers on a non-taxable basis. It was, and again, it's kind of the same framework. It's something that the employee could deduct on his or her taxes as a business expense, and thus it is something that would be appropriately reimbursable by the employer on a non-taxable basis. Going back to the same Tax Cut and Jobs Act, that the ability for the individual to deduct moving expenses has gone away for years 2018 to 2025. And thus, the employer who wants to reimburse the employee for those moving expenses can still do so, but that reimbursement for this time period, including right now, is taxable. So that is a 180 change in treatment from what it typically is. You can still do it. It's taxable. I'll put a little bit more of a finer point on this because this is something that has come up within GCFA's world is, okay, we still want to pay for this move, that especially if it's a job required move. So think of bishops moving from one Episcopal area to another Episcopal area via a change in appointment. In the past, no problem, reimburse as long as the expenses are reasonable and are actually related to the move. Reimbursement on a non-taxable basis, not an issue. The most recent round of bishop moves still were reimbursed. What happens is, because the reimbursement is taxable, if the moving expenses were $10,000, and so you reimburse the individual $10,000, well, they've got to pay tax on that $10,000. And if their effective tax rate is 20%, they're going to only end up with $8,000 in their pocket, which means they've still paid for out of their own pocket effectively 20% of the moving costs. When before they would have paid 0% because it would have all been reimbursable and there would have been no tax. So what some employers are doing is grossing up the amount being reimbursed, so that once the individual pays the taxes, they get pretty close to what the actual costs incurred were. So then, for example, instead of paying $10,000 in reimbursement, the decision might be made to pay more like $12,500. So when they pay 20% of the taxes on that, they're right around $10,000 in what's left over. So again, not necessarily right on point for an accountable plan, but considering we have itinerant clergy that move around, this is something that can come up on a fairly regular basis. And I just wanted to make sure everybody was aware.
This is a relevant question, just popped in. Is there a difference of reimbursement, aka employee submits a bill for the move, versus the employer just paying for the move directly? Or is the amount still taxable even if the business or church pays directly?
It's a great question. And that goes back to in the beginning where I said if you have somebody who's going to travel but doesn't have a employer provided credit card, it's kind of a similar type of thing. If somebody has to buy the plane ticket on their own credit card and then seek reimbursement, you can avoid those types of steps if you're willing to provide the individual with an employer provided credit card that then the employer is paying it directly. That the direct payment or the reimbursement doesn't answer the question of whether it's taxable or not. If it is a business expense that would be appropriately reimbursed under accountable plan, and the employer pays it directly instead through a credit card or writing a check or whatever the case may be, not taxable to the employee. If it is not a business expense of the individual, my silly example of a pastor who's going to dental school, whether the individual pays his tuition first and then gets reimbursement from the church, or whether the church just writes a check to the dental school, same answer, it's taxable. So the process, the IRS doesn't really care about the process. The IRS cares about what is it that's being paid for. Is it a business expense? If it's a business expense and the employee is essentially fronting the money, you can reimburse through an accountable plan on a non-taxable basis. If it's a business expense, the employer can go ahead and pay it directly. So, for example, I have a GCFA provided credit card, and that's what I use to pay when I sign up for CLE classes that I have to take, because GCFA has agreed to pay for those. So I don't have to go through the step of charging it on my own credit card and then seeking reimbursement, which would be on a non-taxable basis if I did that. So I can use the GCFA provided credit card to just go ahead and pay it. And then what GCFA requires me to do is still provide the receipt for that so that they know what I actually spent that money on, and it's something appropriate to be used for. And not to just go buy myself a couch or something. Okay. Oh, one follow-up from Lacey. Change the moving expense to taxable, regardless of who pays, the amount is still taxable to the employee. That is correct. So going back to the bishop example, the Episcopal fund pays historically just paid that directly, if at all possible. And so because bishops move, and some of them move, every 4 years, you're going to have some bishops move around, some new bishops start, some bishops retire. And so to the extent possible, that would pay the moving company directly, and rather than reimbursing the individual after they've paid for it themselves. And the analysis is the taxability is the same result regardless. It's either taxable in both situations or it's not taxable in both. Okay, we're going to go very sophisticated here from an online presentation standpoint, and to have some very simple polls here at the end. So I think Jensen, we do have, you're going to you're going to get the chance to answer yes or no. So what do you think? Treat an accountable reimbursement budget as part of a compensation package. And I realize what the title of this slide is, but
Oh, I did the next slide. I didn't do this one.
oh, you're right. That's why it didn't make sense what I was asking. Since I say the answer to all of these is no on the slide. I'm sorry, everyone. That's we got one more slide to go. Yeah, so don't do these things. Don't treat an accountable reimbursement budget as part of a compensation package. Don't pay out any remaining amount in the budget or the fund at the end of the year. Don't just pay 1/12 of the annual budget each month, no matter what happens in any particular month. Bad plan. Don't spend down the balance without documentation on December 31st. The second, third, and fourth one are all things that can turn the accountable plan into a non-accountable plan and thus make all the reimbursements taxable. So those are things we really don't want to do. They also don't make a whole lot of sense, quite frankly. Paying 1/12 of the fund each month, no matter what, sure makes it look like it's just an extra X number of dollars per month for the pastor in pay. It's not tied to any actual expenses incurred. It's not based on documentation for reimbursements provided. It sure just looks like a little bit of extra on the paycheck every month. Paying out the remaining balance at the end of the year is kind of the same thing, but all in one time. If it's a $3,500 budget for the year and only $2,000 is incurred as of December 30th, and then the church adds $1,500 to the pastor's paycheck on December 31st, that sure looks like that whole $3,500 was just extra compensation for the individual, which is the exact opposite of what this is supposed to be about, which is why I have that first line there. I know there are forms from conferences and things where this is a line on what something might be called a compensation report or compensation sheet. I recognize that. The problem to me is that when you view this, an accountable reimbursement budget or fund as compensation, it leads to some of these other things on the slide. It puts it in a framework of, this is part of my compensation package that I am entitled to. Thus, if there's any money left over, it's mine rather than the church's, or I need to spend all of it. I just think it messes up kind of the viewpoint and the motivations. Again, I recognize this might be a line on clergy compensation forms from annual conferences, and fill out the forms as you need to fill out the forms. But from an internal church standpoint, this would be my recommendation.
I've got two questions here. One, the clergy compensation form includes the AR as part of the compensation package. The pastor needs to designate what part is AR. Is that right? It doesn't seem like it.
Yeah, so the IRS does not like decreasing salary in the context of reimbursing expenses. So to the extent the question is, if the pastor is getting paid $50,000, does the pastor decide, or does the pastor in the church decide that of that $50,000 salary, $2,500 is going to be set aside and designated as a accountable reimbursement budget, and thus the taxable income is only $47,500? The IRS does not like that at all. The recharacterization of income, the IRS is not a fan. If those are the numbers you want to use, say the salary is $47,500 and there is $2,500 of available accountable reimbursement budget, but then again, it goes back to my first my first point on this page, that then is $2,500 of that is the church's, that the pastor is not entitled to the full amount of that. That is then only there for legitimate business expenses, properly approved through whatever requirements the church has in place for how money is spent and what it's spent on. So it changes the nature. And that's why the IRS doesn't like it. For one of the reasons. It's they see it as an attempt to turn taxable income into non-taxable income in an illegitimate way. And I see somebody says the salary insurance are separate sections for from compensation package versus reimbursements. That's good. Okay, now it's poll time. I jumped the gun. All right. So what do y'all think? Does the church or any other employer have to reimburse employees for business expenses? Can a church refuse to cover a particular expense, a particular business expense? Can certain purchases only be reimbursed if approved in advance? And then the last one, and somebody asked this question specifically about a computer, who owns any items purchased via an accountable plan?
The answers are trickling in here. As soon as they slow down, I'll let you know. Some of these are the first one. There's some confusion on here.
All right, I've still got about 30 of you who haven't voted. Don't be swayed by the percentages that are already there if you can see them live. You go with your gut. Go with what you think is right. And Julie, I see your statement that complying with conference policy and you provide a reimbursement amount. That's perfectly fine. I don't have an issue with accountable reimbursement funds or budgets in general. I just see my experience that having it being viewed as some part of the compensation package for anybody just leads to unfortunate results. That's all.
Yeah, they can't see the percentages. It's only you and I.
All right.
Are you ready?
Okay, that's we got 78% in.
Right,
I mean, I can see the. Okay.
We're gonna share the results here. Here we go. Go ahead.
All right. So, does a church or any other employer have to reimburse employees for business expenses? This one was pretty close. 36 yes, or 36% yes, 64% no. The answer is no. There is nothing that requires any employer to reimburse business expenses incurred by its employees. And the reality is, if you don't, you may not have employees for very long because they're going to go find somebody who will reimburse them, especially if you're telling employees you have to go travel to this place or that place to do your job, but all of those expenses are on you. And we're not gonna help you with that. You're not gonna have very happy employees, and so it's probably a bad plan. But there is no requirement to reimburse. The next one: can a church refuse to cover a particular business expense? Almost everybody said yes. Then yes, of course. That's where you get into, again, the accountable reimbursement plan is how you effectuate reimbursements on a non-taxable basis to your employees. It's a part of the overall concept of who decides when and what money is spent on, who decides whether a new laptop needs to be purchased, who decides whether it's appropriate or necessary to have a subscription to this particular periodical, who decides whether the employee should go on this trip that's going to cost several $1,000s. the church should be heavily involved in making those decisions or have policies in place about how those decisions are made, because the church is footing the bill ultimately. Can certain purchases only be reimbursed and approved in advance? Again, yes, of course. You can have a ceiling. So anything above $100, $500, $3,000 has to be approved in advance by certain individuals. Or if it's a trip, the trip has to be approved in advance. Those are perfectly fine. Again, it's the church's money. It can put whatever rules in place on how those decisions are made that it decides is appropriate. And then the last one, and I'll ask it in the way it was asked before, if the church covers the purchase of a computer via an accountable plan, whose computer is it? Well, it's the church's. The church is paid for it. Now, where this typically comes up is, say the church buys a new laptop for the pastor for work purposes in January, and in July 1, that pastor has been appointed somewhere else and moves to a different church. Pastor wants to take the laptop with her. Perfectly fine. The church can say, sure, you can buy the laptop. This is what we think the value is. Or you take the laptop with you. We won't charge you anything for the laptop, but because you now converted this work item into now your item, that's taxable income to you. So we'll add the value of that to your last paycheck, and then taxes will get taken out on it. I use that short time horizon intentionally. If it's the work laptop is bought January 2019, and it was June 2023 when the pastor is appointed to somewhere else and wants to take the laptop with her, that laptop probably at that point is not worth very much, being 4.5 years old or so. So it's not the original purchase price necessarily that would be taxable. It's whatever the value of the item is at the time. And the item could be so old or so used up that its value is essentially none. And then you don't have to worry about it. Okay. So there were a few.
We definitely got some more questions in here.
All right, and we're at past 12 o'clock, but for anybody who wants to hang around for a few minutes, I'll try and knock out some that are here. Submitted a receipt for toner for my computer I use, but I was told that the church has a copier account. Files under account because I use a printer for church work from home. Is this wrong? It's not. I don't know that I can say if it's right or wrong. I think this speaks more to what the church has decided it's going to reimburse and what it's not going to reimburse. Sometimes an employer might say, we can get a better price if we do something directly, and so that's how they have to be purchased. And if you don't purchase it that way, we're not going to reimburse it. I don't know. So I don't know exactly what the situation here is. But if it is a legitimate business expense and then ultimately reimbursed by the church, then it's probably non-taxable. If it is a legitimate expense and the church, for whatever reason, decides to not reimburse it, then it would conceivably be deductible on your tax return. But right now that's not an option, unfortunately.
All right, I'm gonna work from the top down because I think I found where we left off. So we had one participant say to stay in compliance with their conference policy, they do need to provide a reimbursement amount. I think this.
Yeah, and I addressed that one.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Do we have an official document that they can use as a guideline for accountable reimbursements?
Yeah, that's a nice little segue into the last slide. We do have resources on our website. We have sample accountable reimbursement plan policies. We have a lengthy Q&A document that deals with a lot of the stuff that I've talked about here, specific examples. Is this okay? Is that not okay? Jensen, I don't know if you're able to pull the link to the tax packet
I'm
while
working on it right
we're
now.
wrapping up here and put it in the chat. But yes, there's examples here, and I'm sure there's, if you just Google accountable reimbursement policy, you'll probably find some others as well. Who is responsible for determining whether an expense is appropriate or not appropriate? I'm going to answer that two different ways. Appropriate or not appropriate in the sense of my slides from earlier, which is it a business expense or not a business expense? That is an IRS standard, essentially. Again, is it something that could be deducted on the individual's tax return? If so, then it could likely be reimbursed on a non-taxable basis. If it's a question about inappropriate is whether it's something the church wants to pay for or has authorized or decided that it is willing to pay for. That is internal church decisions. I don't know exactly what committee might deal with that. Maybe the finance committee, but those are rules that would need to be adopted internally through the church's internal decision-making process, and then people would be expected to follow it. If the church approves a certain annual reimbursable amount and the pastor exceeds it, is the excess taxable? Not necessarily. Again, because this is not compensation. This is an employer reimbursing an employee for legitimate business expenses incurred in the course of employment. The real question is whether the church decides it wants to reimburse the excess. If it does, and that reimbursement happens in an accountable way, the IRS doesn't care that represents $200 more than what was in the budget for the year. The IRS cares about the process and is it actual legitimate business expense. Leadership approval of that, I think, would definitely be necessary. An interesting thing is who needs to approve it. Is it maybe the group that approved the budget in the first place? If the church doesn't have policies about that, approving deviations from the budget, it should probably think about putting some in place. Having no oversight review of reimbursements is not good. just being 100% honest, it goes straight to the bookkeeper for payment. Somebody really needs to be reviewing those to make sure the appropriate things were purchased or the appropriate amount and the appropriate approvals, well, maybe there aren't any, processes were followed. But it should not just be a rote. Somebody handed me a receipt for $350, and so I'm going to give that person $350. That's going to come back to bite you at some point if it hasn't already.
I'm going to jump in.
Each church, I'm going to this last one. There's one more that's quick. Should each church have a written plan? I assume that's an accountable plan separate from that of the conference. Yes, and build that into as part of your overall approval processes and requirements and minimums and maximums for purchases in general. This is a part of that overall framework about how you reimburse people in a non-taxable way. But it's just a piece of deciding who buys what and when.
I posted a link in the chat to the GCFA forms and assets. If you scroll down on that page to the tax packet area, under accountable reimbursements, there's Q&A, there's a short form policy, a long form policy, and a sample expense voucher, all on the website, as well as many other documents to help you out with all those tax type needs.
I'm sorry, Jensen. I see one more that I have to address. Where did it go? We reimburse the pastor for the full amount for tires for her car. Are they the church's tires? I understand why you're asking that question. To me, that's the wrong question to ask. The question is, why did you reimburse the pastor for the cost of the tires on the pastor's car? I think that's the question the church needs to be thinking about. If it's a church-owned car that is only driven for church purposes by the pastor after the pastor shows up at work, or something like that, then that makes sense. If this is truly the pastor's own car that the pastor drives wherever, vacation, taking kids to school, picking up the kids from school, going to the grocery store, all of that stuff, yeah, probably shouldn't have done that in the first place. Probably not a legitimate business expense, and thus probably not an appropriate thing to reimburse via an accountable plan on a non-taxable basis. To me, that's the more important question at this point than whether the church is tires, though. I mean, they arguably are. But yeah, especially if it was done on a non-taxable basis. But yeah, I reevaluate that decision-making process.
All right. Well, thank you all for being so interactive and asking questions. We appreciate so many of you attending. Like I said, if you registered for this, you will get a copy of the slides. We'll make sure you get a link to the accountable reimbursement policies on our website. And you'll also get a copy of the recording of this video. Somebody asked earlier if they could share this. Absolutely. All of this content is just to help your ministries and equip your ministries. So share that stuff. I saw a couple suggestions for future webinars, including HR matters. So that could be a fun one. That could be a very interactive one, I could imagine. So but we want to thank you all so much for joining, and we hope you have a blessed rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.